Hello and welcome to this session, Carbon Jargon Busting and the Race to Net Zero. My job today is to do some carbon jargon busting with you, help you get to grips with all of these terms like net zero, carbon neutral, carbon negative, climate positive, scopes of emissions, all these things that can be kind of confusing when you first hear them, and understanding the differences between them and how they relate to one another. That's what we're going to be going through today. So first and foremost, let me introduce myself a little bit. So who am I? My name's Andrew Griffiths, and I am the Director of Community and Partnerships at an organization called Planet Mark. We are a sustainability certification. We operate worldwide, and we certify organizations for carbon reduction and the creation of social value. And we've been doing that since 2013, so nearly 10 years. And our community makes amazing progress. So the figures you can see here on the right-hand side are the average figures that our members achieved in 2019, pre-COVID. So pre-COVID, our hundreds of organizations that we certify, from toy shops to retailer, big hotel chains and big construction companies, the average absolute carbon reduction achieved was 12%, and the average reduction per employee was 16%. So we've got a bit of a track record of supporting people on this journey, and today I'm going to help you get to grips with what that looks like and how does it work. And then I've also got an IOD logo in here that's the Institute of Directors in the UK, and I chair the IOD's National Sustainability Task Force here. So first things first, the greenhouse gas protocol. So you'll hear this term scopes of emissions, and you don't need to know everything, but the first thing that we should probably address is, why carbon? Why are we talking about carbon? And, are you talking about other greenhouse gases? What about methane and nitrous oxides and all these other ones? And when you hear someone like me talking about carbon, what I really mean is something that's called carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e. And what CO2e means is essentially the greenhouse gas protocol brings together all of the different greenhouse gases, and it assigns them an equivalent value to carbon dioxide based upon the heating effect that they have on the planet. So take methane. Methane is like a much thicker blanket on the atmosphere. It has a greater warming effect, but it also doesn't last quite as long in the atmosphere. It stays up there less time. So based on those two metrics, the intensity and the duration, scientists calculate and say, okay, roughly 1 ton of methane equals 25 tons of carbon dioxide in terms of that heating effect. And that's what allows us to generate this one lovely carbon dioxide equivalent measure that simplifies things and makes it much easier for us to track what's going on en masse with the greenhouse gases. So then underneath that, we then have 3 different types of emission. You have scopes 1, 2, and 3. And you don't need to know all the details of these, but it is very useful to have a good understanding of what the differences between the 3 categories are. So first of all, scope 1. Scope 1 is the fuel that you burn. So think if you have an oil or gas heating system, or if you own a vehicle, or you own a fleet of vehicles that burn petrol or diesel. That's your scope 1 direct emission, because you are directly burning the fuel and causing the emission. So that's your scope 1 emissions. You burn it, you pay for it. So that's your scope 1. Scope 2 is the energy that you use. So for most people, that's electricity. There are some steam and heating systems, but basically it's electricity, because you're not the one burning the fuel that's creating the electricity, but someone probably is further away, or ideally it's coming from a renewable energy source increasingly. So scope 2 emissions, electricity that you use. So scopes 1 and 2 combined for most companies and most people is your utility bills and your vehicle fleet if you own any cars or vehicles. Now, scope 3 is everything else. There are 15 different categories of scope 3. And you don't need to know all of them, but you've got much more some easy things in there, like employee commuting, business travel, waste. Those things are sort of easier to measure. And then you have, your purchased goods and services, which is your supply chain or your investments and your pensions. All of those things fall in scope 3. So you can see how, usually as much as 90% of an organization's total carbon emissions sit actually in scope 3. And the reason it's important to know that distinction is because if I came to you as a person and I said, I am the most sustainable of sustainables, I am holier than thou, I am I'm very, very sustainable person. And then you found out that the only thing I had measured was my utility bills and my car if I owned one. And I'd left out the food I eat, the places I travel, the products that I buy. You might not think I'd necessarily done enough to justify my look at me, aren't I wonderful approach. And exactly the same thing is true of organizations. What is being measured in a carbon footprint is really, really important. And so this is what that looks like, right? So this is what a carbon footprint will look like for an organization. And you can see how you start to break down the different types of emissions into, what proportion of a carbon footprint do they account for? So you can see on this carbon footprint that 43% of the emissions are coming from buildings. So that will be the heating, the electricity usage and things like that. 13% from travel. So you can see how that breakdown's there. And when you've got that baseline, it enables you to start being a bit targeted in saying, where do we think, if we want to make carbon reductions, where is our low-hanging fruit likely to be? Do I start, we want to tackle everything, but, let's work in a phased approach. Are my biggest opportunities likely to be in water reduction, or are they likely to be in dealing with my building emissions? Well, building emissions account for much more, so that might be where there's some low-hanging fruit. When you look at a carbon footprint, you want to see a number of things on there. It needs to be transparent. You want to see what time frame is this from? What's the reporting year? What's the boundary of those operations? Is this just if they're an international company, is it just their UK or their US operations that they're measuring here? Is it just one office? What's been included? And then you want to know what emissions have been measured, which scopes have been included within this, because otherwise it's very hard to compare to anything else that you see. So this is what you want to see from a carbon footprint. Now, let's talk about net zero. So this is what net zero means, right? This is the easiest way we found of communicating this. So the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is the globally recognized standard for net zero, this is what it says you have to do. So if I'm starting at 100% of emissions now, and I'm doing my baseline, I need to reduce my emissions by 90% or more by 2050. And then only the last 10%, up to 10%, I'm allowed to use carbon removal offsets for. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But you can see how net zero works here. True zero would be going from 100% to 0%, right? But what net zero does is it acknowledges that it's not necessarily possible for many organizations to get to true zero. Like say if I'm a bike manufacturer, there's going to be some emissions in the bike making of the bike itself that they're unavoidable. They're just part of making that bicycle. So what net zero does, it says, okay, there's going to be some residual unavoidable emissions, but those can only be up to 10% of your original baseline. And then you use carbon removal offsets against that. You have to include a 50% reduction by 2030, and the deadline is 2050 for achieving net zero. That in the UK is a legal requirement now. All organizations have to be net zero by 2050. So what are carbon removal offsets? Carbon removal offsets are things that actually suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So think trees, peatland, seagrass. Those are your sort of natural solutions that suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and hold them for a long period of time. Now, there are technologies, but they are very expensive and quite ineffective at the moment in comparison to natural solutions. So we want to see more of that, but natural solutions are the most effective carbon removal offsets that we have at the moment. The other type of offsets are carbon avoidance offsets, and these are far more common. So carbon avoidance offsets are ones like things that avoid more carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, but they don't suck them down, suck the emissions down. So, for example, investing in a solar farm or a wind farm, or cleaner fuel, stoves and things like that. Because, if I install a solar farm, a solar farm doesn't suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That's not its job. What a solar farm does is it avoids more carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere because I'm no longer burning fuel to generate that same electricity. So we avoid more going in, but we're not sucking down. So the reason this is important is that for net zero, you have to be using carbon removal, which kind of makes sense, right? Because you have to be removing the equivalent amount from the atmosphere in order to net off. If you're just avoiding more going in, you're still causing some emissions. So you've got to be reducing in order to do that netting. So that's why it has to be carbon removal offsets specifically, and they have to be certified and accredited by an appropriate body like Gold Standard or Vera or one of those sorts of bodies. Now, how does that compare to carbon neutral, right? So this is what the orange line here is what carbon neutral means. So carbon neutral, I could measure my carbon footprint today and find out it's 1,000 tons, and I'd offset that 1,000 tons like that, and hey presto, I'm carbon neutral. I have to commit to measuring my scopes 1 and 2 emissions. But an important thing to note here is that net zero, you have to be including all of your scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions when you finalize achieving that net zero target. You have to include all 3 scopes. Carbon neutral, it recommends that you measure and reduce scope 3, but there are many instances of companies who are simply measuring scopes 1 and 2, the fuel you burn and the energy that you use. And therefore, they might be setting quite a low bar for what they're achieving in terms of carbon neutrality. Carbon negative, carbon positive, climate positive, these terms actually have no real legal definition at all. Carbon neutral does and net zero does. But carbon negative, climate positive, all of these things, they don't. But what people tend to mean when they say them is that if I have 1,000 ton carbon footprint, instead of buying 1,000 tons of offsets and being carbon neutral, I buy 2,000, 3,000 or 4,000 tons. And now in principle, I'm offsetting more than I've emitted. But I, again, might only be measuring my scopes 1 and 2 emissions. And I might be using either carbon removal or carbon avoidance offsets to justify it. So you can see the difference in ambition here. And, ultimately the message that I have for you is net zero is the journey that we are on. Fundamentally, that's where it's going. That's where it has to go. Carbon neutral and carbon negative, these are nice things. They're good steps on that journey, but they have to be part of a wider net zero strategy. They're not an end destination in and of themselves. So that's the overarching message I want to take away. Net zero is the journey that we are on. And so what does the net zero journey look like? So let's come back to the idea of a fictional, ambitious bike manufacturer, right? And they want to achieve net zero. And the reality is that it's not going to be a beautiful curved line that gradually slopes down and makes its way to net zero. In reality, it's going to look a bit different. So the actual path is going to look a bit more like this. Maybe we have some low-hanging fruit to begin with. And so we start with a baseline of 1,000 tons of carbon emissions. And in the first year, we switch to renewable energy. We install some energy efficiency measures like LED lighting. We begin engaging our employees, getting them to reduce their waste, to recycle more. And so we achieve, 350 tons of reduction in the first year because there was a lot of low-hanging fruit, which frankly we should have done sooner, But then once we've done the low-hanging fruit, it kind of gets a bit harder. And so we spend a couple of years, we're still reducing, we're still making progress, but we've got a lot of the big heavy hitters out of the way early doors. And so we start planning, where are our next big opportunities and big things. And we plan some of the things that cost more money or take more time. And then over the next few years, we deal with those. So we start electrifying our vehicle fleet. We engage our supply chain. We come up with materials innovations to make our bicycles out of different things. And again, we achieve some really big reductions because we've invested over now a period of 5 years or more. And then we're making our way down. We're continuing to do things. So we're continuing to engage with our suppliers and get that supply chain to reduce. We're looking for circular production methods and all of that good stuff. So this is a fictional example of what it looks like. It's not a pure smooth journey. It's a jagged road, and it requires ongoing development of strategy and ongoing governance on an annual basis to check that progress. And so this is what that looks like in terms of how this is affecting organizations, right? So this is an email from a major supermarket retailer in the UK called Tesco's. And they sent this email asking that all of their suppliers to disclose their carbon emissions, set a net zero target by the end of 2022, set a science-based target with a 50% reduction by 2030 by the end of 2023, and that they needed to switch to renewable electricity if they hadn't done so straight away. Now, this is an example of how, if you're a small business, if you're an entrepreneur, if you want to be working with big organizations, you're going to need to be working toward a net zero strategy, because they're going to ask you for your data. They're going to say, I need to know your carbon emissions. They're going to say, I need to see your net zero target. So you need to be thinking about this if you're starting your own business, or if you have your own business. How am I going to, engage with the kind of asks that I'm getting for data and for progress toward net zero? Because you are a part of their scope 3 emissions. And so they have to, in order for them to achieve their net zero target, they need to engage with you. So hopefully that was informative, that we've covered some of the main things. We covered net zero and carbon neutral. We covered the scopes of emission. We covered the different types of carbon offsets. And so hopefully that, helps you get to grips with some of those key terms. But the big encouragement is join the race to zero. If you're setting up an organization, pledge a net zero target, make sure that is woven into the very fabric of your business. And if you'd like to get support on that, please do reach out, and you can explore Planet Mark certification. We operate in the US and the UK and indeed worldwide, all over in Asia and other places. And if you'd like to understand more and you don't feel like you've fully gotten to grips with it yet, we run monthly net zero carbon essentials workshops that are CPD accredited in the UK, meaning it's continuous professional development certificate that comes with it. And you can go to our website, find our events, and they're all hosted online, 3-hour workshop to really dive into the meat and the bones of how do you measure, what do you need to do, how do you come up with an action plan, and how do you communicate what you've done in authentic and credible ways that mean that you don't get accused of greenwash. But hope that was useful. And I'm looking forward to the sort of discussion panel later, where we can hopefully dive in some questions. So please do come to that with any questions that you have that I haven't addressed in this talk.